Welcome in, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here for this explainer. Today we are setting the stage to explore a decade of dramatic, literally whiplash inducing shifts when it came to the roles of British women. We are looking squarely at the 1920s. This was the time of flappers, newly won freedoms, and honestly, incredibly stubborn traditionalism. It's a fascinating era of two steps forward and one very distinct step back.
Picture this central question painted on a massive, bold protest placard from the era. Did winning the vote actually win women equality? It's the question that completely defined a generation. And, well, the answer is way more complicated than a simple yes or no. Let's find out why. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our strict chronological roadmap through the 1920s. 1. Early shifts from 1919 to 1921. 2. Legislative wins from 1922 to 1925. 3. The flapper era in the mid-1920s. 4. Equal franchise from 1926 to 1929. And 5. Lingering limits from 1930 to 1931.
Section 1. Early shifts, 1919 to 1921. The immediate post-war period? Man, it was a harsh reality check. As the Great War ended in 1918, women who had just tasted these incredible new freedoms in the workforce were suddenly and heavily encouraged to return to domestic service. Why? Well, so they wouldn't compete for male occupations. But just 1 year later, in 1919, the Sex Disqualification Act was passed. This was a massive, absolutely crucial milestone for middle-class women. It meant they could no longer be barred from careers in law or the civil service just because of their gender. And by 1921, we start to see a huge boom in a completely different sector, clerical work. During this exact same period, we also see political history being made. So let's do a quick rapid-fire definition sequence here. First up, by-election. This is an election held in a single political constituency to fill a vacancy that pops up during a government's term. And this specific mechanism is exactly how the first woman to take a seat in the House of Commons actually got her position. And that leads us directly to our second definition, peerage. This is a legal system of hereditary and lifetime titles in the UK, which often requires the holder to sit in the House of Lords. So, you might be wondering, how do these two terms connect? Well, a politician named Waldorf Astor inherited a peerage. This forced him completely out of the House of Commons and up into the Lords, and that triggered a by-election, leaving his seat wide open. And guess who took that seat? His wife. I mean, imagine the 1919 newspaper headline, Nancy Astor wins by-election to become the first female MP to take a seat. No way, right? Now, the grand irony here is that Astor had never actually campaigned for women's rights. She made this massive breakthrough largely due to her aristocratic family connections. But once she was in power, she brilliantly flipped the script. She ended up proposing several bills to improve women's rights and fiercely urged female MPs from all parties to unite. While Astor was breaking ceilings in Parliament, an explosive shift was happening on the ground. 1 million. That's a massive number. By 1921, over 1 million women were employed as typists or clerks, making it the absolute biggest growth area for female employment at the time. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the dramatic contrast by the end of the decade. We see that incredible 1 million figure in 1921 shrink drastically down to just 300,000 by 1929. So, despite the new industries and new acts, many women remained stuck in low-skilled jobs. They were working long hours and navigating a rapidly fluctuating, totally unpredictable employment landscape.
Section 2. Legislative wins, 1922 to 1925.
During this mid-1920s window, women secured unprecedented legal victories. In 1922, despite deep, entrenched prejudice, 33 female parliamentary candidates were adopted by the main parties. Now, they were often placed in totally unwinnable constituencies, but the pressure worked. By 1923, we get the Matrimonial Causes Act, and just a year later in 1924, the Guardianship of Infants Act. And this brilliantly illustrates just how steep the political climb was for these women. After the 1923 election, there was a staggering 99% male presence in the House of Commons. Just 1%. A total of 8 women made up the entire female representation. To put that into really stark perspective, that tiny 1% of the House of Commons was somehow supposed to represent a demographic that actually made up over 50% of the general population. Because of that imbalance, organizations outside the government, like the National Union for the Societies of Equal Citizenship, had to lobby aggressively just to get their voices heard by this 99% male majority. But let me tell you, that 1% fought hard, resulting in two massive steps for legal parity in marriage and motherhood. Step 1, the 1923 Matrimonial Causes Act. This meant a woman no longer had to prove cruelty or desertion on top of adultery just to get a divorce. Huge change. Step 2, the 1924 Guardianship of Infants Act finally gave joint custody of infant children to both parents. These were absolutely massive foundational wins for legal equality. Section 3, the flapper era, mid-1920s. So, while politicians debated away in the Commons, a total cultural explosion was happening out in the streets. And this brings us to one of the most iconic terms of the 20th century, the flapper. A flapper was a fashionable young woman intent on enjoying herself and totally flouting conventional standards of behavior. This meant seriously loosening those old social restraints. Women were suddenly seen in public way more often, smoking, wearing makeup, and going out to the cinema or dance halls entirely on their own. Visually, the transformation was staggering. It was like something straight out of a bold 1920s fashion magazine. The elaborate, restrictive Edwardian dress completely disappeared. Hems rose boldly to knee level. Corsets, which were basically the ultimate symbol of physical restriction, vanished entirely. And that long hair was chopped right off into highly stylish short bobs, often paired with those classic bell-shaped hats. It was a complete physical liberation from strict historical norms. But of course, traditionalists panicked. They kicked off this intense morality crusade against the new, boyish look. Employers tried to ban short skirts. And then we have this genuinely bizarre medical warning. Get a load of this quote. Doctors condemned high-heeled shoes, saying that they would cause a displacement of the uterus. Yes, you heard that right. A displaced uterus from high heels. Even a woman's jumper was viewed by some as a, quote, dangerous sign of gender confusion. Section 4, Equal Franchise, 1926 to 1929. Moving completely past the displaced uteruses and dangerous jumpers, the absolute climax of the political struggle was centered on one word: enfranchised. This simply means being given the right to vote in political elections. While women had won a limited vote right after the war, true equality at the ballot box was still something they were fiercely fighting for. And in the late 1920s, we finally see the ultimate legislative triumphs. In 1926, the new English law of property allowed both married and single women to hold and dispose of property on the exact same terms as men. Then, the absolute crown jewel, 1928's Equal Franchise Act finally gave all women over 21 the right to vote. And just a year later, in 1929, Margaret Bonfield shattered the ultimate ceiling, becoming the first female cabinet minister. Let's move to and see how this builds in Section 5, Lingering Limits, 1930 to 1931. As we cross over into the 1930s, we really have to contrast those glittering political wins with the incredibly harsh societal realities that still anchored women down. To understand those limits, you have to understand this deeply restrictive policy, the marriage bar. This was a widespread practice where female employees were basically sacked the minute they got married. It heavily targeted teachers, nurses, doctors, cleaners, and civil servants. In fact, despite the 1919 Act we talked about earlier, 4% of female civil servants were expelled every single year simply because they tied the knot. So the crucial point is captured in one massive number: 181,000. Because of the marriage bar, the total number of female teachers dropped from 187,000 down to 181,000 by 1931. And honestly, that number would have been way lower if women hadn't actively hidden their marriages from their bosses. By 1931, the weekly wage for a working woman had fallen right back to the pre-war reality of just half the male rate, all while government messaging constantly pressured them back into the so-called ideal home. So I leave you with this to ponder. With the vote finally secured but wages slashed and careers basically outlawed by marriage, had true equality actually been achieved, or was it just an illusion printed on a ballot? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope it opened your eyes to a truly complex decade.